y'all, welcome to Killer Queens, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, Torella, and like most millennials, I've always had an obsession with true crime. On KQ, you'll find light true crime stories, millennial hypes and gripes, some adult language, and maybe a special guest here and there. Just like a 90s sleepover, we're just a couple BFFs hanging out, so gather round and let's launch right into it. This episode contains discussion of kidnapping, murder, gun violence, and torture. Listener discretion is advised. In April of 1992, Exxon executive Sidney Riso left for work like he did every single day. When his car was discovered running in his driveway, the police and FBI were called. They quickly began an investigation into Sidney's disappearance, which they learned was an abduction. After cooperating with the kidnappers and getting together the $18.5 million ransom, though, the kidnappers began to make sporadic contact, often days and weeks between phone calls. This lasted for 51 days before a break, which led the kidnappers right to the FBI, and we ultimately found out what happened to Sidney Riso. I mean, you gotta be thankful for dumb bitch criminals, right? And I want to thank Mark for writing this one up, and I want to thank Mark for requesting it. Oh my gosh, thank you. He kind of said he fell down the rabbit hole of reading stuff about CEOs being killed and stuff like that after the United Healthcare thing, and this one piqued his interest, and it is very interesting. I have never heard of this. I had no idea. So, hold on to your butts. Let's talk a little bit about Sidney Riso. He was born in the mid-1930s and lived in Morris Township, New Jersey. There's not much information available about his early life and upbringing, but we do know a little bit of who Sidney was. From a young age, Sidney demonstrated a strong commitment to education and a drive for excellence, traits that would define his professional career. After high school, he followed his passion for problem solving by earning a degree in engineering, which became the cornerstone of his future in the energy industry. Always eager to grow and learn, he also pursued an MBA, gaining the skills and insights needed to thrive in the business world. Now, in the 1950s, Sidney began his career with the Exxon Corporation, then it was called Standard Oil, starting in entry-level positions. His early roles gave him valuable insights into the energy business, and his keen intelligence and dedication quickly set him apart. Over the years, Sidney steadily climbed the corporate ladder, taking on increasingly significant responsibilities and earning the trust and respect of his peers and his superiors. And it was that trust that helped him rise through the ranks and be appointed as an executive of Exxon International. By this time, he'd spent decades of his life contributing to the success of the company. Sidney was known for his sharp problem-solving abilities, a collaborative leadership style, and a deep understanding of the energy sector. On the personal front, Riso married Patricia, who went by Pat Riso, with whom he had 2 children. Despite the demands of his high-powered career, Riso remained a devoted husband and father, prioritizing time with his family and maintaining a balanced life. If he wanted to, he would. This is a high-level executive with fucking Exxon. I'm just putting that out there. Not trying to start any fights, but that's a pretty important job. Well, it's a big job. You know what I'm saying? Anyway. Friends and colleagues often described him as humble, kind, and deeply committed to both his professional and his personal responsibilities. He was extremely humble, something that is generally lacking amongst people who have achieved professional success on the level that he had, right? He and Pat would spend some of their little free time going to local shelters and volunteering to serve food to the less fortunate. Why? This man was so nice, and he was such a good man. Why? It wasn't something they did for publicity. They didn't do it to get kudos from people. It was just what they felt like they needed to do to give back to their community. So that's going to bring us to over 30 years ago. I'm sorry. Over 30 years ago in April of 1992. 1992 was over 30 years ago. And if you think that hurt my feelings, you're absolutely fucking right. All right, so now we're going to go back to then and to one of the biggest kidnapping investigations the U.S. had seen to that point. By this time, Sidney and Pat's children were older. Seemed like they were probably, one was in college, one about to finish high school. We are not totally sure of their exact ages at the time, On a Wednesday, which is April 29th, the then 57-year-old Sidney kissed Pat goodbye after they'd had breakfast, and he left for work like he did every day around 7:30 a.m. Now, he was very, very habitual. He had this routine that he did all of the time. And because of his position at work, the company had offered him a company car and a driver to pick him up and drive him to and from work daily. But Sidney said, no, I can just drive myself. I'm fine. Some friends and family speculated that the drive helped him clear his mind after working, and it seemed like something he really enjoyed doing. So he did. And it seems like he didn't use the company car because the car that he was driving that day was a Volkswagen or like a hatchback thing. So I wouldn't think that's what they'd give him for a company car. Anyway, he drove himself. So his routine in the mornings was he would pull out of their garage, he'd go down the driveway, he'd stop, he'd get out, and he'd pick up the newspaper that was at the end of the driveway before he would head off. Now, let's talk about their neighborhood a little bit, just to kind of give you a visual picture of it. As you probably expect, it was a more upscale neighborhood. The houses are not right on top of one another. Each one has a bit of privacy with trees and hedges and are generally further back from the road with decent-sized driveways. I point this out because it explains why there would be a lack of witnesses who would have seen Sidney that morning. So, a little later in the morning, one of Sidney and Pat's neighbors noticed that Sidney's car was sitting at the end of the driveway and it was still running, which again would be very noticeable if you lived in a house that was just more compact and everything closer together, right? If Pat's still in the house and she's cleaning up the kitchen after breakfast or whatever, she might look out the window and be like, wait a second, why is this car still there? But it's just not necessarily set up that way. So it's just interesting. So she sees that the car is still running, but Sidney's not around. And she approached and saw that inside the vehicle were his coat and his personal belongings, including his briefcase, which he always brought with him everywhere. She was instantly alarmed about the bizarre circumstance, and she called her husband, who happened to work with Sidney. She may have also reached out to Pat and been like, hey, what's going on with this? Just to be sure that, maybe Pat didn't know of something else going on or whatever. So the neighbor's husband got a hold of the Exxon corporate security on site, who went in to check and see if Sidney was at work. And when they found out that he wasn't, they called the Morris Township Police, who then got in touch with the local FBI office. So authorities quickly arrived at the Riso home and started their investigation. They talked with Pat, and she told them that she last saw Sidney when he pulled out of the garage. She assumed that he'd driven down the driveway, grabbed the paper like he did every day, and then went to work. From all the indications at the scene, it appeared that Sidney had vanished, leaving his belongings and the car still running. Initially, there were all different kinds of theories floating around, right? The FBI said that from the beginning, all options are on the table. One theory was that Sidney wanted to disappear. He wanted to leave his wife. I didn't mean to say wife. I meant to say life, but I guess that would include his wife. He went Ryan Boogerwater right there and was like, deuces, I'm going to Eastern Europe or whatever. That was one possibility. It was possible that he drove his car down the driveway and had someone waiting for him to flee his family and his life. This theory was quickly shot down, though, after talking with friends and family. Sidney and Pat's marriage was as strong as ever. They had no financial issues. They had no hidden debts that Sidney might be trying to get away from. I don't know exactly what kind of money he made, but as an Exxon, literally top executive, I would imagine a pretty whole heckload. So they seem to be doing just fine. So that wasn't something that he would be running away from. His job was not in jeopardy, nothing like that. There were no indications that Sidney would have fled on his own accord at all. Another theory had to do with Sidney's health. So it was known that he'd had heart problems. So investigators thought that when he got out to get the paper, maybe he began to suffer a heart attack. He got disoriented. Could he have wandered into the surrounding woods and collapsed? Maybe this is a medical emergency and we just need to look around and we'll find him and we'll get him medical help. So they organized search teams to comb the nearby woods, but after searching, there were no signs that this theory was correct either. While they might have been afraid to say it up to this point, everyone was thinking the same thing. Sidney Riso had been abducted. So they began to look into coworkers to see if someone might have a grudge against Sidney, but they quickly discovered that he was very well liked by everyone he worked with and everyone who reported to him. If this was a kidnapping, it was already different from the norm in such cases. The FBI says that generally contact is made by kidnappers very quickly to establish what's going on and what they want, right? Or they'd leave a note or something. There's no note or anything like that. But in Sidney's case, no contact had been made from anyone and hours had already passed. Local police and the FBI set up a joint task force and operated out of the Riso residence. But the day turned to night and no call came. Despite contact not being made immediately, investigators believed that Sidney had been kidnapped because it had happened before. In the 1970s, Victor Samuelson, an executive with Exxon, was kidnapped in Argentina. He was the manager of an Exxon subsidiary's refinery about 60 miles north of Buenos Aires. He was taken by a guerrilla military group and held for more than 3 months while Exxon worked with the Argentinian government to facilitate a ransom payment of $14.2 million. Samuelson was released after the ransom was paid and returned to the U.S. and to his family. This proved that Exxon would be willing to pay a ransom. They just needed the kidnappers to make contact. When 24 hours passed without contact from anyone, investigators started to get pretty worried before a call came into the switchboard at Exxon. A woman on the other end said that they had Sidney and that further information about the kidnapping would be found in a letter that was left at the Livingston Mall, which wasn't far away. The woman told them the letter would be taped to a light fixture in the parking lot. So investigators hightailed their ass to the mall and found an envelope with a letter. With the letter, they had included Sidney's Exxon company credit card as proof that they had him. There were no fingerprints on the envelope or the letter and no watermarks anywhere that could be tracked. In the letter, the kidnappers claimed to be environmental extremists, accusing large corporate entities like Exxon of destroying the earth and harming countless forms of life. Which, okay, but if your whole thing is saving and respecting life, you're doing something pretty dangerous to another human being, but okay. This was only a few years after the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska, which leaked almost 11 million gallons of crude oil after running aground. The letter was signed by the, quote, Fernando Pereira Brigade Warriors of the Rainbow. The FBI quickly decoded this signature. The Rainbow Warrior was a green space ship that had been blown up in Auckland, New Zealand, in an act of terrorism by France. And Fernando Pereira, which I am a country bumpkin, and I'm not saying that right, had been a photographer on the ship who had died in the explosion. The letter also stated they wanted to be paid $18.5 million in exchange for Sidney in the form of used $100 bills. They were very particular. They wanted it to be in fucking Eddie Bauer bags too. But, real detailed. But then they would miss calls that they were supposed to do. And they, they'd wait, they'd get real sporadic with their contact. Very weird. Anyway, at the time, it was the highest ransom demand in any kidnapping, but Exxon was ready to pay to ensure for Sidney's safe return. The letter instructed that the next step to be taken was for Exxon officials to obtain a cell phone and run an ad in the Star Ledger newspaper. And in the ad, they were to mention, quote, rare international birds and the cell phone number to contact. The plan was to use that cell phone to next make contact. They also said that when they called, they wanted Exxon's public information officer, Jim Maracas. Maracas. That's a fun last name. Like the shaky maracas, right? Yeah. Preparations began to get everything the letter demanded, but Exxon and the FBI both agreed that it would be better to have an agent take that phone call. So they assigned someone to be Jim on the phone, which they don't fucking know Jim. I could be Jim. It's so funny. They're like, make sure it's Jim. Anyway. All right. So Jim and the agent spent hours going over everything they could think of to prove that he was Jim. They went over his personal life, the history of Exxon, hoping that any question they could be asked, he would have an answer for. The kidnappers said that if their demands weren't met, they would keep Sidney in isolation with no food or water until he died. That's terrible. 2 days after Sidney was abducted, the ad was put in the paper as the ransom letter demanded. The money was ready. The cell phone hotline was ready to go as well. At this point, they had to wait for a call to come in. Hours passed after the ad was printed, but finally at 9:30 that evening, the call came. On the line, though, there wasn't a kidnapper. They played a recording of Sidney telling them to get the money and he would be released safely. Essentially, they made Sidney plead with the investigators to work with the kidnappers to save him. In the recording, he also said that another letter would be at a nearby park, which was found beneath a picnic table. There were additional instructions on how the money should be packaged. They wanted it split up into 10 different Eddie Bauer duffel bags. But 18.5 million in $100 bills weighs literally a ton, 2,000 pounds. So each bag would be 200 pounds. We learned this in that docuseries called Heist, when the guys robbed the airplanes that were like coming in to drop off the money for the armored trucks. And they were like, holy fucking shit, these things are fucking heavy. Like they had to grab way less bags than they were thinking, because it's like, you just think, oh, I'll pick up, some money with some dollar bills in it. That stuff is not light. The FBI decided to use larger denominations of bills to lessen the weight of the bags, and they were able to get it down to 600 pounds total, which would be much more manageable for them and for the kidnappers. And I mean, honestly, that is a big difference. So way to go. The FBI's goal, though, was for this to never get to the point of them giving any money, obviously. They wanted to find these people before it got that far. 2 days passed with no contact. While waiting, they go over their list of anyone who could have possibly even had the slightest problem with Sidney and question everyone they could think of, but still there were no leads. On May 3rd, another call finally came in. The agent pretending to be Jim answered, and the kidnappers bought it. Because of course they did, because you don't fucking know Jim! But there would be no negotiations, only demands from them, of course. They wanted the ransom exchange to begin immediately. They were instructed to go to a phone booth outside a restaurant about 13 miles from their base of operations. Once they arrived, they would be told what to do next to get the money to the kidnappers. So 2 agents sat at the phone booth for hours, but no call came in. They have the money ready to go. They don't call, they don't show up, and then days pass and they have no contact. It's just like they just ghosted. On May 14th, a letter arrived via the mail. In the letter, the abductors claimed that because Exxon allowed the police and the FBI to interfere, Sidney was moved out of the country. But by this point, the FBI had begun to suspect that the persons responsible were not an environmental group at all. Their emphasis on environmental issues was being downplayed in each interaction, and much more attention was being paid to the money, obviously. They also thought that since the areas they had been directed to go each time were so off the beaten path, they must be local to know about them. It's not like some group that is just like has come here just to kidnap this person, right? It seemed like they really didn't have all these like international connections like they had said before. The kidnappers also thought that because they were calling into a cell phone, new technology at the time, that the calls could not be traced, but that was not true. All the calls that came into the cell phone were traced back to local payphones within a 20 to 30 mile radius. So they're not calling from some like other location, right? They're like calling from right the fuck over there. The police recanvassed the neighborhood and found a witness who said that they saw a white van on the street the morning that Sidney disappeared. They looked into any white vans registered in New Jersey at the time, and they found over 70,000. Yikes. Neighbors also reported that on a couple of occasions, a blonde woman had been out jogging down their street in the early morning. A composite sketch was made, but nobody could identify this woman. Their suspect list included a blonde female and one of the 70,000 owners of a white van. Forensic technicians also found a dog hair on one of the letters, and it was determined that it belonged to a golden retriever, the most popular dog for a family in the US to have. It is like literally the poster child of a family dog. They began to use every resource they had to get a list of people who own that type of dog and cross-referenced it with white van registrations and blonde women who might also be a disgruntled Exxon employee. Each new lead they found only broadened their investigation, and they felt like every new clue just expanded their suspect pool. 17 days after Sidney disappeared, a call came in from the female kidnapper and told them another letter was at a different shopping mall. This letter contained similar threats and demands as the others, but it also included that they wanted Pat to go on TV and beg for Sidney's safe return. This is just sick. Without hesitation, Pat was like, yeah, absolutely, I will go on TV and I will do this. In her statement, she said she was willing to do whatever was necessary to have Sidney return home, and she hoped it would be very soon. Investigators hoped this would finally push the kidnappers to finalize the details of the swap and bring Sidney home, which, like, Get it together, kidnappers. We already had the money like a while ago. Why are you just like farting around? You're dilly-dallying. Come on. June 18th, 51 days after Sidney was kidnapped, the cell phone rang and a demand was made to deliver the money just before 3 p.m. 5 more calls came in within the next hour, asking questions, giving different directions. They asked where they wanted the money delivered, and the voice said they would be told shortly. But the FBI investigators had been thinking about all the calls coming in from all these local payphones. And as these calls were coming in, they had brought in over 300 agents and they were staking out every payphone they could within the local area. And by the way, we saw something, heard something, I don't remember. Kids have been home forever for Christmas break and now we're about to get freaking snow, so they'll be home again. Anyway, something was said about a phone booth. And the kids were like, what's a phone booth? And I was like, oh gosh, they've never seen one. Why would they see one? And so I Googled them and I pulled it up and I was like, well, this is one. And they recognized the red ones from like London, but they didn't. When I showed them the ones here, they were like, no. And I was like, well, they were like, why would you need a booth for a phone? And they were like, do you take your cell phone in there? I'm like, no. There was a payphone attached to it. You put quarters in to make phone calls. There was a phone book. That's a whole other thing. And, because you didn't have cell phones before, you might not have a way to reach somebody. So if you were out and you needed to place a phone call, you would go to a phone booth and you had to have coins on you to make sure that you had it. And they were astonished because they didn't. It's just so funny, like the things that like they're not even around anymore. And honestly, I don't remember ever seeing a phone booth being removed from anywhere. Like I know we used to have them, or at least pay phones, even if there was no booth, at least a pay phone. They had to take them down, right? But like I've never seen them take it down, It's very much like if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, did it fall, right? Like, where the fuck did they go? I never saw them take them out. I know they used to be there. But anyway, kids have never seen them. It's just kind of funny. As everyone waited in position, 5 hours passed with no further calls. But at 9:08 p.m., a call came in. The voice told them to leave now and go to Tingley Road at Patriots Path and then look on the ground for an envelope. So they took the cell phone and they headed out. A little after 9:30 p.m., they found the envelope, which directed them to another location about 5 miles away. Is this like just their live stream of doing like a fun scavenger hunt? Like do that with your friends, They were still getting brief calls from the kidnappers on the cell phone, instructing them to hurry up. At 9:50 p.m., they found another envelope taped under a bench, which directed them to a former school 4 miles away, which directed them to another location. And every location they went to, they had to search around for several minutes to find the hidden envelopes before they would be directed to the next place. In the letters, the kidnappers indicated that they should be arriving at certain times, but as they headed to the fourth location, they were more than 30 minutes behind the times the kidnappers were expecting them to be. As they got to this location, a payphone was ringing, and the man pretending to be Jim picked up. The kidnapper on the other end asked if the train had gone by. He realized that on the other side of the parking lot was a small train station. Now the time schedule made sense. They believed that the kidnappers wanted them to get on the train and drop the money off at different stops along the train's route. But because of wasting time having to find letters, they were too far behind and they'd missed the last train. So the kidnappers said they would call back with further instructions, and they waited for the phone to ring. Also, if you are that dependent on a fucking time schedule, then do something fat, like have one location that they go to. My God, you're like, go here, now look around. You're not going to know where it is. Like, you're going to get off schedule. Oh my gosh. While they waited though, an agent staking out payphones radioed in. She had just seen a stocky white male make a call while, quote, Jim was talking to the kidnappers. She noticed that he had put on latex gloves before touching the phone. She didn't try to make an arrest, but she waited and got a physical description of him and the license plate of his vehicle. They traced the license plate, which came back to a local rental car agency in a nearby town. They contacted local police in that town and got the emergency number for the owner and called her and woke her up and said, look, we need you to get to the store immediately. They needed to see the rental records, so they sent a car to pick her up. She later told the agents that she had never been in a car that was going that fast before. Investigators arrived at the rental agency, and according to the records, a man named Arthur Seale had rented the car. As they were grouping up in the parking lot, a car pulled in, and it was Arthur Seale returning his rental car. They quickly sprung into action and apprehended him. As they were doing that, another car pulled in. It was Irene, who went by Jackie Seale, his wife, who was there to pick him up. But who were these people, and how were they related to Sidney? Well, Arthur had grown up in the area. His father was deputy chief of police. He went to a military academy for high school. He was a football star there, where he met and later married his high school sweetheart, Irene. They were an all-American couple, not someone the investigators would have ever suspected of being responsible for Sidney's kidnapping. Arthur followed in his father's footsteps at one point and was a police officer in New Jersey. While working, he had suffered a leg injury and retired from the force with a disability pension. And after that, he got a job with Exxon Security, specifically doing work with executive protection. He had a ton of working knowledge of Exxon's procedures and their executives. And at one point, there was a position open that would have been a promotion for Arthur, but another candidate was chosen. And he felt like he was being unfairly passed over, so he resigned from the company, planning on making a move to the Carolinas to start a business. Irene grew up similarly to Arthur in a middle-class family. She was in college studying to become a teacher when she and Arthur got married. They ended up having 2 children, and they lived near family to be there to take care of them as their parents got older. But Arthur and Irene had begun to live outside their means. So they'd purchased a 35-foot sailboat and had plans to sail around the world, even though neither of them knew how to sail at all. They purchased matching Mercedes cars. They had always dreamed of making it big in whatever way that they could and like making tons of money. They did make the move to Hilton Head, South Carolina, but after a short time, they found themselves in financial ruin and had to declare bankruptcy, and they returned to New Jersey to escape local creditors. Very quickly, Irene cut a deal with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence. She confirmed what they had been suspecting, that Sidney Riso was no longer alive, and he'd been dead for weeks at this point. He died just a few days after he was abducted. Irene was the blonde lady that people had seen running in the early mornings in that neighborhood, and she'd been doing it for 4 months before the abduction to learn Sidney's routine. Do you see why I don't believe in jogging? The morning of the kidnapping, as she ran by the Riso's house, she kicked the newspaper further away than usual. So typically it was left in a place where Sidney could just like open his door, reach down, grab it. He didn't have to get out of the car. So she kicked it to where it was further away and he wouldn't be able to just reach out. So he had to actually physically get out of the car and walk over to get it. So while he was doing that, Arthur jumped out of the white van they were using. He abducted Sidney at gunpoint. Arthur then forced Sidney into the back of the van, and Sidney saw a large coffin-sized wooden box in the back, and so he started to fight. Arthur shot him in the arm, which forced him into compliance, and Irene quickly drove the white van away. Arthur duct taped Sidney's mouth, eyes, and wrists as they drove 30 miles to a storage rental unit. They moved the wooden box inside. They checked on Sidney, Irene said usually twice a day, but only gave him a little bit of water and once in a while a little piece of lemon. 3 days after the abduction, the temperature rose, hitting around 100 degrees in the storage unit. Nobody checked on Sidney. The next day, they went to check after he had gone at least 24 hours without water in extreme heat, and surprisingly, I guess to them, Sidney had passed away. So they took his body to Bass River State Park, or Bass River. It's probably Bass River. You know, I'm all about that bass or whatever. Irene pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy and extortion charges. She was given 20 years in prison for her cooperation against Arthur and for taking investigators to where they had left Sidney's remains. And she was released in 2009, November. Arthur pleaded guilty to kidnapping and murdering Sidney, and he was given a 95-year prison sentence. And I do not know where Irene is today. Fucking idiots. Absolute fucking idiots. Like, $18.5 million is obviously a lot of money, but if you're gonna do that, then fucking go get the money. Like, if you're trying to get money for this man, then keep him alive. Why would you stick him in a storage unit and give him no food and water? They had kids together, so I'm assuming they understand how to keep a human alive. Like, oh my gosh, it's just terrible. And they watched him for 4 months. How fucking creepy is that? And why Sidney? Like, I guess Arthur would have known him from working in the detail, but like, why him specifically? Maybe he knew that Sidney was actually well-liked and he was really good at his job. And so, from the previous kidnapping, he knew that they'd pay the money. But man, why Eddie Bauer bags? I just wonder about that too. That's odd. But there you go. Arthur did try to appeal his sentence later and asked for compassionate release, and they said absolutely the fuck not. So in prison he will stay. But that's it. That's this week's case. Let me know what you think about it, and I will see you next week. Love you. Bye. If you like this episode, be sure to like this episode and follow the show so that you never miss out on new episodes. Get in on the conversation on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us at Killer Queens Pod, or you can join our Facebook discussion group at Killer Queens Podcast, where we discuss cases covered on the show and all things 90s. If you want to submit a case to be covered on the show, visit killerqueenspodcast.com/case submission and just complete the form. And if we cover the case, we'll give you a shout out on the show. Lilas.